All right, so let's continue here with the bulletin then tonight. Pupils at Centurion's prestigious Cornwall Hill College have spoken out against racism at that school. Parents also joined in protest about the slow pace of transformation at the institution among teaching staff and the board. The school's language and hair policy has also come into question. We're joined now by WITS Centre for Diversity Studies, Professor Melissa Steyn, and Director at Jasoro Consulting, Tessa Dooms. Thank you both for your time tonight. I think given the fact that you really are the social observers in this instance and the experts, if I can go as far as saying that, let me begin with getting your own observations and reflections in terms of what's really at play when you watch what the learners have said, this addendum that they've put together from 2020, and the fact that only today are we seeing any kind of response from the school that seems to address the issues raised by these learners. Professor Steyn, let me begin with you.
Good evening, Kathy. Well, you know, it seems very clear to me that what we have here is a school that is very young, that had an opportunity to start off with ground rules that would reflect the society that we live in, and that there clearly has not been a will, there's been a lack of political will on the part of the leaders in the school to create the kind of environment that they claim they are creating. If you look on their website, I had a look at it just a little while ago, they talk about the focus on the individual child. They talk about creating a safe environment for every individual learner. But clearly this has not happened, and we have to ask ourselves, you know, why would this be? And I'm afraid that the conclusion that we have to reach is that people have sort of been hoping that they're not really going to have to concede anything, and that they're going to be able to remain gatekeepers of the culture of the school in such a way that it's not really going to be inclusive. So for me, this really is a failure of leadership. You know, I believe that the school is run by intelligent people. I can't believe that they're not. And it's just really difficult for one to understand. You know, if I can understand there's issues around like hair and the importance of having children, you know, studying in an affirmative and affirming environment. I find it very hard. Kathy, you can understand it. Tessa can understand it. How can it be that these leaders can't understand it? So it has to come down to a lack of will.
Tessa, your own observations and reflections?
Kathy, for me, this is just another South African day. We live in a society where racism is entrenched and where racism has become a normalized part of our society, and people actually are shocked when they are confronted with their own racism because it's so normalized. And I mean, we are sitting with a group of young people here who were born in the 2000s. Yeah. And if we think about it, many of their teachers would be in their 20s and their 30s right now, and they would not have lived through apartheid. So you're dealing with two generations potentially here who have not lived through apartheid but are still dealing with the entrenched racism that our world and our historical society has inculcated in us. And I think we must get to terms with the fact that whatever we think our country is in terms of the ways in which we've overcome the legal racism in our country, we have to come to terms with the fact that culturally our country is still very much about white people and whiteness and white culture. And many young people, and you'll see it on Twitter, many people are talking about the fact that they used to be in those schools. I was in a school like that. I was in a school where I was not affirmed, and that was me 20 years ago. I've been out of high school for 20 years. But I also went into a culture and into a workplace environment where I was not affirmed. And so there's this continuous cycle, and at least at a high school level, you know, the teenagers can speak out because they're not going to lose their jobs for doing so. But once people get into the corporate world, they're faced with exactly the same set of circumstances, because culturally, our culture is still dominated by whiteness and white supremacy, and until we deal with that, we will not make any progress.
Tessa, what you're saying is such an important issue, because often, Prof, some of the difficulties that people have in expressing their full experience of an environment that is discriminatory against them is that they often don't have the language to describe exactly what has been done, especially where the cases are not as overt as perhaps some of these learners have identified.
Yes, I think that's true, and I think that's one of the tasks that we do have, which is indeed developing a language, a vocabulary, a grammar for talking about these issues. Although I do want to say that I think the younger generation is way ahead in terms of being able to name what is actually happening in these kinds of contexts. But Kathy, I also want to say that what becomes clear when you look at this is that this is not really an issue about difference per se. I think that, we, in a way, we obscure the issues when we keep talking about, the ways in which difference is being managed or handled or not. This is really about equality, and what is really feared by people in these leadership positions is not difference, it's equality. It's about actually having pupils come from, or scholars come from different backgrounds, and being able to have an equal right to feeling good about themselves. And so it really is, it's an equality question, and I think we need to name it as such.
Tessa, there's some people who, in response to what has been playing out, say, well then, why are black parents taking their children to these schools where they're not allowed to speak, in any of their home or mother tongue languages on the school premises? Why don't they just take them to different schools where those kind of things will not be an issue?
Well, Kathy, there are two answers to that. The first is that the answer to racism is not retreat, it's confrontation. It is being able to name it and being able to challenge it so that it can change. And so this idea that we're going to retreat into separate societies just means that we're going to be comfortable with an implicit apartheid in this country forever. And I think we cannot concede to that as a society. But the second one is actually a bit more problematic for me, is that even if you go to a township school, even if you go to a school that is predominantly black, there are still issues around hair, and there's still issues around calling African hair unkempt, and people saying you have to, wear it in particular ways so that it's disguised from its natural form. Because even within our own context, as black communities, we still take on and we assume that when we are preparing our children for the world, we're preparing for them for a world that is going to judge them on those bases. And so even in the schools that are traditionally and predominantly black, we still have those kinds of judgments because we believe we have to prepare children for a world that's going to be hostile to them because they are black. And that's the reality in our country, no matter where you go. And so the underlying issue is that we are a racist society, and children are reminding us that just coming out of apartheid was not enough, and we have not done the work necessary to transform.
Professor Steyn, we heard an apology from officials at the school today for not having handled the concerns that were raised by the pupils and their parents through these protests much earlier. In terms of a foundation for what happens next, that's just the first steps, but what should they also be doing in addition to that apology?
Well, it's almost tedious to have to listen to these apologies coming in these ways because, where have people been? Ignorance is no excuse. There's so much information. And just, establishing a proper dialogical kind of relationship with parents and with children would have helped them to understand what their policies should be around hair and issues like that a long time ago. So I would really say that apologies all good and well, but really, show us the money, do the work now, and stop prevaricating, stop trying to gatekeep and pretend and hope that somehow it's not going to catch up with you. Again, I mean, I think this is just really poor leadership, because good leadership is ahead of the curve. Good leaders are able to read their societies, are able to anticipate what's coming and lead from the front and be ahead of the curve. But what we see here is this kind of reactive behavior, sort of like hoping that it's not actually going to come home to roost, and that somehow you're going to get away without actually changing the culture at the school. So I think it's like yesterday that they have to have acted, and they really need to look at all their policies and do some of the things that they're saying they're going to do, like training their staff and trying to get people's attitudes up to where they should be at this moment in history.
I guess it's also easier to apologize when the glare of the cameras is on you. Tessa, let me give you the final word on this one.
I mean, in terms of what the school needs to do, firstly, they need to admit racism. The second thing they need to do is commit to racial literacy, not only for the school's leadership, but also for the learners in that school who have taken in a culture that is breeding racism. The third thing they need to do is open up that space, both in terms of their teaching staff, their board, and their students, to a space that allows for more diversity, that is not only allows for it, but actively seeks out more and more diversity and takes away any barriers that makes diversity difficult, like the policies around language and hair. Until the school is willing to confront itself and introspect, this is all just going to be for PR, and once it blows over, they'll just go back to business as usual.
Tessa Dooms is the director of Jasoro Consulting. Melissa Steyn, Prof. Melissa Steyn, that is with Wits University. Let me thank you both for your time on News at Prime tonight.